One of the things I love to do is I love to put myself in the scriptures, and I love to just imagine with creative imagination. And I hope that doesn't kind of scare you, but I always put myself in this scenario. So even when I watch a movie, I become one of the characters. And when I'm reading a book, I become one of the people. And so when I'm reading the story, I put myself in it. And when we were just referring to angels, I love the story of the angels coming to the shepherds and saying, "Be not afraid." It had been dark for 400 years. God hadn't spoken. The sky lights up like blazing glory. The angels shout glory to God in the highest to these poor shepherds that were sleeping by their flocks at night and said, "Don't be afraid." I would have been dead, like completely. I would not be telling the tale because you'd be picking my body off the hillside because of just absolute shock. Well, I was not the angel, I'll tell you that. I was definitely the shepherd by the hillside there. So I have another question for you. I want to go back to the story of creation. And Adam and Eve walked with God. Do you ever wonder, what did they talk about? I wonder, but I can't imagine. What would you say with God? Like, pardon me? Yes. I mean, just the vastness. Exactly. And just think of the magnificence of man and God. Now, I remember being challenged by this by a book that we sold a long time ago. It was called Wild at Heart. It's still a very active ministry that's going on. But in that story, he said, before creation, Adam walked with God alone. And there was no garden. There was no boundaries. There was nothing. Can you imagine that? Now, just a little interlude in that. I always write notes because I get sidetracked and then I have no idea where I even was, so I can get back to it. But what I found fascinating is that there's a book that we've sold. It's kind of done its course, but it was called Surfing for God. And the book is all about a man's journey. He was a counselor and a pastor, and it's his journey through pornography. And incredibly addictive pornography. Maxed out all his credit cards, and he was a pastor in the city of Cleveland, and he would go to porn places and various places of ill repute, if that's good enough to say, maxing out his credit cards, going to church, doing ministry, and his wife had no idea there was anything going on. And then one day the FBI raided one of these places, and they were going through the little black book and checking out all the people that had visited it. So here's a pastor of a city knowing that this is coming. He finds himself, he was a good Presbyterian, he finds himself going to a Catholic church and just crying out to God because it was open. And it began his journey of, why am I like this? And as he journeyed through this, there was one night where God just spoke to him very clearly and where the title of the book came from. And he said, "Michael, every time you search the internet, you're looking for me." You see, we were designed for incredible intimacy with God. And we fill it with everything we can think of because we know the void. Deep inside of us, we know the void. A couple days ago, I was hosting an online prayer retreat that we do through One Way. And it's fascinating to me. Pastors, ministry leaders, workplace people, we invite them. And I often hear, "I'm really afraid because I've never spent a day with God in my life. I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know what he's going to say." But deep inside, every one of us is this longing for God. Now the beauty of our relationship with our true God is that he is the only God that offers this relationship at no cost of what we can do, aside from surrender our lives, not of works, lest any man should boast. It's too good to be true. So we struggle with that. We want to add our qualifiers to it. Well, if I do this and I work hard, he will do this. No. By grace, you're saved through faith. period. I have to receive it, but it's already available for me. So it's incredible. So I actually look at this and I wondered, what would happen with Adam and then Eve? What would they talk about? And I think it's the beauty. I mean, I hope I don't scare you, and I hope you stay for the day, but one day I was out working. I live on an acre of land that we will be moving off of, and my ditch was all filled with thorn bush and all this wild overgrown stuff, and I was whacking away, and I love to use just natural things. I don't like buzzers, and I don't like gas-powered things. I love to hear the birds and the trickle of the water, and I love to sweat once I've gotten sweaty, and just work out. And I was in there whacking away, and all of a sudden I just stopped, and I said, Lord, why do I love this so much? And he just said to me, I created you in a garden, didn't I? I missed that one. We were made to walk in a beautiful, perfect garden. And John Eldredge also writes, he said, all of us crave to have the garden again. We all want to create our own little garden. Why are we all drawn in the springtime? Why are we drawn as a culture to just want to create beauty? It's in us. The very nature of this creation is in us and never leaves us because we were made to be there. Unfortunately, as you know the story, and as my wife reminded me, Adam was right there when Eve sinned. Said nothing. Yay, men. So we can say, well, she sinned, and we can also say, yeah, but we watched her do it. Yeah, what a hero. But Romans 5 verse 19 says, one man's disobedience placed all men under the threat of condemnation, but one man's obedience has the power to present all men righteous to God. And I've been really just kind of getting my head around that. What does that really mean? And for most of my journey, it meant that I'm sure of heaven, and I'm sure that there's this faith around and this connection with God. But for most of my life, it's only been in the last probably decade, I've been realizing this means I have free access to walk with you again. You have restored what has been stolen. In the Amplified version of 1 Corinthians 15:45, it says, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last man, Christ, became a life-giving spirit, restoring the dead to life. We have been restored to walk with God. Jesus' resurrection, death and resurrection, provides us this place. And so as John 10:27 says, when we come into this relationship with Jesus, Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice. That little exercise we did back there, my sheep hear my voice. We know the voice of the one we know. A friend of mine lives in Rosetta, just outside of Lanark, and he has probably 60 or 70 sheep, and he knows every one of them by name. I love to go and visit him. And he calls them by name. Here, Kira, and they're all Welsh names. He's from that part of England, but close to Wales. And he calls them all by name, and he knows this one likes its chin rubbed. And the ram's over here. He said, oh, don't turn your back on that one right there. No, don't. And he'll just get his rod, and he'll just twist the little horn on the ram there, because this is my friend Doug. And it's like, ooh, thank you. But it's fascinating because I can go and I can say, come here, and they won't even pay attention to me. But as soon as they see him, they come right to him. Fascinating. Just as a side issue, he also has Pyrenees dogs to protect the sheep. And they're fascinating. He also has a border collie to herd the sheep. And when any of those dogs see me, especially the male dogs, they are ready to take me apart. Here's a plump little piece of meat we could do. You know what I'm saying? Until my friend says, he puts his hand on my shoulder, and he said, this is Doug. He is my friend. And the big Pyrenees dog just rolls over, bit my stomach. And I think, I can't believe it. 2 seconds ago, you were ready to rip me apart. Now it's like, okay, let's do this. and then just nuzzles me around like an overgrown puppy, wanting me to play with it. They know the shepherd's voice. The question that I really just want to leave with us this weekend is, do you know his voice? Do you know his voice? Jesus restores what the enemy has stolen. He restores us to be able to walk in this freedom with God again. And I realize it's a broken world. I realize there's all sorts of competing things for our voices. I realize the enemy is here always speaking, trying to condemn us. You know, there was one night where Linda was away, and we have an ensuite washroom, and I was just walking past the TV into the ensuite washroom, and I heard this voice, and it said, turn on the TV. And we don't have TV. We have internet now, but we don't have TV. But at that time, I think we had Bell Express View, and I turned on the TV, and it was a full, little to the imagination sex scene. And it was the first time in my life I stopped and said, who said that? How could I hear that voice? And that negative experience drew me to say, God, if the evil one has access to me to speak to me that clearly, I want to hear your voice to speak to me that clearly. Why should the enemy be able to speak to me and I don't know how to hear your voice? So that began this beautiful journey. What Satan meant for harm, God uses for good. It began this beautiful journey of recognizing that God speaks to his children. He calls us by name. He knows us, everything about us, made us into his image. My wife and I had the privilege a whole bunch of years ago, 8 years ago maybe, to go to Israel. Was that right? Val, you're covering Linda, so I can't see her. 9 years, 10 years, 5 years, 6 years, whatever, you get the point. It was a whole bunch of years ago. And it was quite funny because her parents said, we just want to give you a gift, and you can go anywhere you want in the world. And we had considered going to England. We'd considered going down the Rhine. Neither of us had ever considered to go to Israel. We're not one of those, although she's an American, we're not one of those tourist people that just wants to go with busloads of people and a guy with a big Bible and preach at you for hours and hours. It's like, no, that would just, I don't want to go to Israel and be preached at all day. That would just be like, no, please, please, please. Let me just see the sights and walk the fields and just smell it and look at the red flowers that grow there and nowhere else and all that kind of stuff. So some friends of ours from Carleton Place were arranging a tour. And there was only 12 that were going, 10 at the time. And my wife and I both looked and thought, let's go to Israel with people we know in this small little group. And so we went. We arrived in Tel Aviv and were greeted. It was a whole one of those tours where you don't have to do anything. You don't even need to take your suitcase with you, which the older you get, that's a way easier because you don't leave anything behind. They follow you like little house parents or something. It's wonderful. But we went. And I loved it. We loved Galilee. I see why Jesus loved Galilee. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. It's like going to Muskoka and just the quiet of Muskoka. Only Galilee's more beautiful. And then we made our way down toward the end of our time. We made our way down to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is such a contrast. Tel Aviv and the coast is like pagan Los Angeles. It's just absolutely pagan. And then you go up to Galilee and it's quiet and restful. And then you go to Jerusalem and it's incredibly religious. You have very devout Muslim people and very devout Jewish people, and the women all cover their heads, and if they don't cover their heads, they wear wigs instead of covering their heads. So it was fascinating to see this culture. Everybody had wigs on. I thought, what is this? And then you realize it's how they cover their heads. They have lots and lots of kids in Jerusalem, and it's you never miss the sounds of the loudspeakers when it's time for the Muslims to pray, and it's just a very, very different city. So our guide, who was very clearly right up front, he was an American, but he had returned to his Aliyah, or whatever it's called, Aliyah. He had returned to Israel and was living there, and he was a guide, and he said, don't try to convert me. I know the Bible better than most of you, and you won't be able to convert me. Okay, straight up. And he did. He knew his Bible inside and out. He was part of the Israeli government, and they trained him, and so he took us to a place where a lot of people would say this is where Jesus was buried. And it's a very tomb-like church. I don't want to say this disrespectfully, but I absolutely hated it. It was dark. It was cloudy inside. It was like smoke. It was. I just thought, oh, and people kissing a stone where they thought the body was laid out, and it's like, he's not here. It just didn't do for me what I thought they thought it was going to do. A little while later on, we went to an area of East Jerusalem, which until the war in 1967 was part of Jordan, and it was it was Muslim. And so East Jerusalem was fascinating to me because you hear this little enclave, and it's just a different culture than the rest of Jerusalem. And we went to a little mission. So our Jewish guide takes us to a mission. I find that fascinating. And the mission is run by people in Britain who found this land in 1867 and discovered there's a skull there, and the place of the cross is up here. Wow. So they bought it and made it a mission site that's been running, in spite of it being Muslim controlled, since 1867, as a missionary, as a mission. What I really found fascinating is that our guide, our host, was a Palestinian who struggles at times to get through all the checkpoints and all the hassle it is when you're Palestinian in Israel. And he struggled, and he didn't know who we were at all. He didn't know anything about us. And he said, I just want to tell you about Jesus. And here's this man in Israel, a Palestinian, telling me about Jesus who walked this land. He said something that I would say is absolutely life-changing, absolutely worth the whole trip for me. It's a beautiful garden where this tomb is. And you can see the tomb. You can see where the place of the skull was, and it's very small. He said, a lot of people think it's outside the city. No, it's just outside the wall. The Romans crucified, so everybody would see him being crucified. It was right here in this visible place. So we could see it. But he said this. He said, isn't it amazing that Jesus rose from the dead in a garden and restored what happened in the original garden? Do you get that? You know the story of Peter. He says to Peter 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? After Peter denied him 3 times. Jesus restores what the enemy steals. And if it's true or not true, if that's the actual place, just that idea that he would restore this beautiful place of the garden. Fortunately, we just kind of eased in because we were a small little group. We eased in the middle of these tours, and I followed Linda into the garden tomb. It was absolutely beautiful because I was the only one there. She had left, and you had this tomb. And the strange thing about going to the tomb there, if you've not been there, is it's empty. Now, of course I know it's empty, but it's actually, when you see it, if you're visual, it's empty. There's no one there. And immediately, I heard this hymn, and it was just by In Christ Alone, who took on flesh and just no guilt, no nothing, and now he stands in victory. Death has lost its curse on me. The hymn just filled the room, and then I just walked out and went back into the city of Jerusalem. My heart is for us to understand that Jesus longs to walk with us. Now, the number one way we always hear God is through his word. Always. I'm involved in a ministry called Church Renewal. If you don't know about it, it's absolutely amazing ministry. It would be like Alpha is. And it always takes you into the word. Always. We can't hear God if we don't know the word. We will hear wrong voices and not know it. Satan doesn't come across and say, "Psst, this is Satan." It would be easier if he did. But he sounds convincing and real. And sometimes you don't know it's him. But if you know the word, you won't be fooled.